Every Navy SEAL knows the name Master Chief Ethan Vance. He is a ghost, a stone-cold killer who treats human lives like simple math. So when a female outsider walked onto his top-secret training compound, Vance decided to break her publicly. He dropped a single .308 round into her palm and issued a death sentence to her career. One bullet, 700 yards, a blinding dust storm. Hit the steel target or get off my base. Vance expected her to fail. He expected her to pack her bags. What the legend didn't realize was that she wasn't there to pass his test. She was there because years ago, he had made a mistake that almost cost her everything, and he had just handed a loaded weapon to the absolute wrong girl. The desert sun didn't just shine at Outpost Delta, it punished. The air was a thick mixture of jet fuel, dry sand, and sweat. Located in an undisclosed sector of the Mojave, this wasn't a standard military base. This was the proving ground for the Advanced Special Operations Command, a place where the military's top 1% came to see if they could survive the remaining 0.01%. Standing in a perfect, rigid line on the tarmac were 12 men. They were giants, built out of scarred tissue, Kevlar, and unyielding discipline. These were Rangers, Delta operators, and battle-hardened Marines. And then there was Maya. Maya stood at the very end of the line. Compared to the mountain of muscle next to her, she looked entirely out of place. She wore a simple white tank top, tactical pants, and her blonde hair was tied back in a swift, no-nonsense ponytail. She didn't have a chest rig weighed down with grenades. She didn't have a decorated uniform. To the untrained eye, she looked like a lost civilian. To the men standing shoulder to shoulder with her, she was a joke. "Is this a joke?" whispered Miller, a Tier 1 operator standing 2 slots down. "Did the brass send us a secretary to take notes?" A few muffled chuckles rippled through the line. Maya didn't turn her head. She didn't blink. Her eyes remained locked dead ahead on the horizon. She had heard it all before. The doubts, the whispers, the smirks. People always assumed that because she didn't look like a brick wall, she couldn't tear one down. Suddenly, the laughter evaporated. The entire tarmac went dead silent. Walking out from the shadow of a hangar was Master Chief Ethan Vance. Vance was a living myth in the special operations community. He was the man they sent when the mission was deemed mathematically impossible. His face was a roadmap of violent encounters. A jagged scar ran from his temple down to his jawline, and his eyes were the color of cold flint. He didn't walk, he prowled. When Vance entered a room, air pressure seemed to drop. He stopped in front of the line of candidates, his hands resting on his tactical belt. He didn't speak for a full minute, letting the oppressive heat and his suffocating presence do the intimidating for him. "Look at yourselves," Vance finally spoke, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed under a boot. "You think you're elite? You think because you survived a few deployments you're ready for what we do here? Out there in the dark, your titles mean nothing, your medals mean nothing. Out there, you are either the predator or you were target practice." Vance began walking down the line, pacing slowly, examining each man like a butcher inspecting meat. He stopped in front of a massive Ranger, poking a finger into his chest. "Too heavy, you'll slow the team down." He moved to the next. "Too tense, you'll pull the trigger before you verify the target." And then Vance stopped. His boots crunched against the gravel as he turned sharply to face Maya. The silence on the tarmac stretched so thin it felt like it would snap. Vance looked her up and down. A cold, cynical smile tugged at the corner of his scarred lips. He didn't see an operator. He saw a public relations stunt. He saw a political move by Washington to force diversity into a shadow unit. "And what do we have here?" Vance asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you lose your way to the media briefing room, young lady?" The men beside her grinned. They expected Maya to look down, to stammer an excuse, or to show a flicker of fear. Instead, Maya slowly turned her head and met Vance's gaze. Her eyes weren't filled with anger or panic. They were completely hollow, calm, lethal. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be, Master Chief," she said softly, her voice steady and chillingly level. Vance scoffed, shaking his head. "This is special warfare, Durrell. We don't do participation trophies. I don't care who your daddy is in Washington, and I don't care how many fitness exams you aced in a controlled indoor gym. You don't possess the instinct. You don't have the stomach to take a life when the world is burning around you." He reached into his tactical vest. The candidates watched in fascination as Vance pulled out a heavy, pristine rifle cartridge, a single gleaming .308 caliber bullet. He stepped closer into Maya's personal space, trying to use his massive frame to dwarf her. He held the bullet right between his thumb and forefinger, mere inches from her face. "I'm going to save us both some time," Vance growled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I don't waste ammunition on tourists. You see this? This is one chance. I'm going to give you one shot to prove you belong in my world. There is a steel target on the ridge, 700 yards away, hidden by the dust storm rolling in. You get one bullet. You chamber it, you fire. If you miss, you pack your bags, get on the next transport plane, and you never let me see your face again." He dropped the heavy brass bullet into her open palm. It felt cold against her skin. "Prove it," Vance challenged, stepping back, crossing his arms. "Prove you're not just a waste of my time." The other operators shook their heads. A 700-yard shot? In a rising desert dust storm? With an unfamiliar rifle and zero time to calculate windage, humidity, or bullet drop? It was a setup. It was a guaranteed failure, designed to humiliate her and send her packing before the first day of training even officially started. Maya looked down at the single bullet resting in her hand. For a brief second, the world seemed to slow down. She felt the weight of it. She felt the eyes of 12 elite men mocking her. She felt the arrogant, burning gaze of a Navy SEAL legend waiting for her to fail. A slow, dangerous smile crept onto Maya's face, a smile that none of them expected. She closed her fist tightly around the brass round. She looked up at Vance, her eyes locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "You should have kept your bullet, Master Chief," Maya whispered. Without waiting for his permission, she turned and marched directly toward the heavy sniper platform at the edge of the tarmac. The wind howling across the sniper platform carried a heavy sheet of biting yellow sand. Visibility was dropping by the second, turning the distant mountain ridge into a blurry, shifting silhouette. It was a sniper's worst nightmare. The dust created an optical illusion, making targets appear hundreds of yards closer or further than they actually were. To hit anything in this weather required more than just math. It required an intimate relationship with the wind. Maya climbed the wooden steps of the elevated platform, her boots making a rhythmic, steady sound against the timber. Behind her, Master Chief Ethan Vance stood at the base of the platform, his arms still crossed over his massive chest, his face an unreadable mask of cold anticipation. The 12 elite candidates stayed gathered near the tarmac, watching intently. None of them believed she could pull this off. Some were smirking, waiting for the loud crack of a missed shot to seal her eviction notice. Others just wanted to get this pointless delay over with so they could start their real training. Resting on the sandbag mount at the center of the platform was a heavy, bolt-action Macmillan TAC-300 sniper rifle. It was a devastating precision weapon, but it was completely unadjusted for her. The scope hadn't been zeroed to her eyes. The stock hadn't been adjusted to her shoulder height. Maya approached the rifle. She didn't look at the dial settings immediately. Instead, she stood perfectly still for 5 long seconds, letting the wind hit her face. She closed her eyes, feeling the exact direction of the crosswinds against her skin, measuring the speed by the way the desert sand stung her neck. She was reading the atmosphere. "Clock's ticking, young lady." Vance's voice boomed from below, cutting through the roar of the wind. "The dust storm isn't going to wait for you. Take your shot or pack your bags." Maya ignored him completely. She dropped down into a prone position behind the rifle, her movements fluid, practiced, and entirely devoid of the nervous tension Vance usually saw in rookies. Her body formed a perfectly straight line directly behind the recoil path of the weapon. She opened her right hand, revealing the single, pristine .308 caliber bullet Vance had handed her. With her left hand, she smoothly pulled back the heavy bolt of the TAC 300. The chamber opened with a sharp, metallic sound. Maya placed the brass round into the breech, slid the bolt forward with a heavy click, and locked it down. The weapon was live. She pressed her cheek firmly against the stock. Looking through the high-powered loopholed scope, the world transformed. The crosshairs danced slightly against a sea of swirling dust. At 700 yards, the steel target was nothing more than a tiny, dark speck, completely obscured by waves of heat and blinding sand. "She's not even adjusting the turret," whispered Miller down on the tarmac, watching her through a pair of binoculars. "She hasn't touched the windage dial. She's just gonna blind fire it." "She's terrified," another operator replied. "She just wants to get it over with." But Maya wasn't terrified. In fact, her heart rate was dropping. Her mind drifted back to the secret Vance didn't know, the hidden history that connected them. Years ago, in a completely different desert, a young, arrogant Navy SEAL team had executed a high-value target raid. They relied on intelligence that was deeply flawed, intelligence authorized by a rising officer named Ethan Vance. That night, their crossfire had torn through a local compound, leaving a young girl buried under the rubble of her own home, surviving only because she knew how to stay silent in the dark. That girl was Maya. She had spent the last decade rebuilding herself from the ashes, joining the military under a clean, untraceable record, solely to reach the apex of special operations. She didn't want revenge. Revenge was sloppy. She wanted to prove that the legends who ruled this world were flawed, fragile, and replaceable. Through the scope, the dust storm flared up, completely erasing the target from view. A wall of sand was passing right through the valley. Vance watched her from below, a slight frown finally creasing his forehead. Any normal shooter would have panicked and pulled the trigger before the visibility got worse. But Maya didn't move a muscle. She lay there like a statue, completely fused with the rifle. Her breathing was incredibly slow, rhythmic, and controlled. She was waiting. In a sniper's world, wind moves in cycles. A heavy gust is always followed by a microsecond of calm, a brief pocket where the air pressure stabilizes before the next wave hits. Suddenly, the wind roared, shaking the wooden beams of the platform. Maya didn't flinch. And then, just as quickly, the wind abruptly dipped. The heavy curtain of dust parted for a fraction of a second, revealing the faint, gray outline of the steel target 700 yards away. Maya's finger, resting gently on the curved trigger, began to apply a slow, steady pressure. She didn't pull the trigger. She let the mechanism surprise her. In the brief space between her heartbeats, at the absolute bottom of her exhale, the trigger broke. Crack! The deafening roar of the TAC 300 shattered the desert silence. A massive plume of dust blasted out from the muzzle brake, kicking up sand around the sniper platform. The heavy recoil pushed into Maya's shoulder, but her body absorbed it perfectly. Her eye never left the scope. Down on the tarmac, the 12 operators held their breath. Vance didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the distant ridge. For 2 long seconds, there was only the sound of the wind. And then, echoing faintly across the desert valley, came a sharp, unmistakable metallic sound. Pang! The sound of lead obliterating solid steel. Miller dropped his binoculars, his jaw slightly open. No way! She hit it! Dead center! A stunned, suffocating silence fell over the entire compound. The 12 elite candidates looked at each other in absolute disbelief. A 700-yard shot, unzeroed in a blinding dust storm with a single bullet. It wasn't just luck. It was a display of absolute, terrifying mastery. Maya smoothly pulled the bolt back. The empty, smoking brass casing flew out of the chamber, glinting in the harsh sunlight before bouncing off the wooden deck. She caught the hot casing in midair with her left hand, completely unbothered by the burning heat of the metal. She stood up, holding the spent casing, and walked to the edge of the platform. She looked down at Master Chief Ethan Vance. Vance's expression had completely changed. The smug, condescending smirk was entirely gone. His eyes were wide, staring up at her not as a nuisance, but as a threat. He recognized that look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of a trainee wanting approval. It was the look of a predator staring at its prey. Maya tossed the hot, empty casing down. It landed in the sand right at Vance's boots. "Like I said, Master Chief," Maya spoke, her voice carrying clearly over the dying wind. "You should have kept your bullet." Without waiting for his response, she walked down the steps and took her place right back at the front of the line, leaving the legend standing alone in the dust. The atmosphere inside the tactical briefing room was thick with tension. The walls were covered in digital topographical maps, satellite arrays, and high-resolution reconnaissance photos of hostile territories. A single red digital clock on the wall counted down the seconds to their next assignment. The initial shock of Maya's legendary shot on the tarmac had subsided, but it had been replaced by something far more dangerous: resentment. The 12 male candidates sat at a long steel table. Maya sat at the very end, deliberately isolated. To the elite operators, her impossible shot wasn't a display of skill they respected, it was an insult to their egos. They were men who had spent their entire lives being the absolute best in their respective units. To be outclassed on day one by a woman who didn't even wear a standard uniform was a bitter pill to swallow. "It was a fluke," Miller muttered, leaning back in his chair, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "The wind died down right as she pulled the trigger. A lucky gust of wind doesn't make you an operator, it just makes you lucky." "If you think luck can calculate a 700-yard cold-bore shot in a crosswind, Miller, then your instructor at sniper school failed you," Maya said, not even looking up from the combat knife she was carefully cleaning with a cloth. Her voice was entirely flat, devoid of anger, which only made her words cut deeper. Miller slammed his hands on the table, standing up. "Listen here, girl." "Sit down, Candidate Miller," a voice boomed from the doorway. Master Chief Ethan Vance walked into the room. The room instantly fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Miller quickly took his seat, keeping his eyes locked straight ahead. Vance walked to the head of the table, his combat boots clicking heavily against the concrete floor. He didn't look at Maya, but the empty brass casing she had thrown at his feet earlier was now tucked into the tactical vest over his chest, a grim reminder of the challenge she had thrown down. "You think today was about shooting?" Vance asked, his cold flint eyes scanning the room. "Shooting is the easy part. A trained monkey can pull a trigger. Out here, survival isn't dictated by how well you can aim through a piece of glass. It's dictated by what you do when everything goes entirely to hell." Vance hit a button on the main console. The digital map on the wall shifted, displaying a jagged mountainous region deep within a hostile foreign territory. "Tonight, we begin the real evaluation," Vance growled. "This is Hell's Gate. It is a 60-mile stretch of unmapped, heavily monitored mountain terrain. You will be dropped into the drop zone in pairs. Your objective is simple. Navigate the terrain, avoid the tracking teams, and reach the extraction point on the other side within 24 hours. If you are caught by my tracking teams, you fail. If you run out of time, you fail. And to make things interesting, you will carry no weapons, no food, no water, only a map and your instincts." A murmur went through the candidates. Moving 60 miles through hostile mountainous terrain without a weapon or provisions was an incredibly brutal task. It was designed to push their bodies to the absolute point of physical and psychological failure. I will personally be leading the tracking team, Vance added, a dark, menacing smile spreading across his scarred face. And I promise you, I will hunt you down like dogs. He turned his eyes slowly toward Maya. The air in the room felt like it froze. And since candidate Maya thinks she's so advanced, she doesn't get a partner from this line. She will navigate the terrain entirely alone. Let's see how well your luck holds up when you're freezing, starving, and being hunted by a real predator. Maya didn't blink. She simply met his gaze and nodded once. Understood, Master Chief. Try to keep up. The other operators looked at her like she was a dead woman walking. Challenging a Navy SEAL legend on a firing range was one thing, but challenging him in his own element, the dark, brutal wilderness, was pure suicide. 3 hours later, the heavy ramp of a C-130 transport aircraft lowered into the black, freezing night air. The wind roared into the cargo bay as the plane flew low over the jagged peaks of the mountains. One by one, the pairs of candidates jumped into the abyss. When it was Maya's turn, she stepped up to the edge of the ramp. The freezing air whipped against her face. She looked back at Vance, who was standing inside the cabin, his arms crossed, watching her with intense scrutiny. Without a single trace of hesitation, Maya stepped off the edge, disappearing into the dark. The moment her boots hit the rocky ground, Maya was in motion. She quickly unclipped her parachute, rolled it up tightly, and buried it beneath a pile of heavy stones to hide her entry point. She didn't have a rifle, but she didn't need one. She possessed something far more dangerous, a mind built for survival. While the other candidates immediately began moving along the standard, logical paths through the valleys to save their energy, Maya went the opposite way. She began climbing the steep, vertical rock faces, moving up into the high, dangerous peaks. She knew exactly how Ethan Vance operated. He was a conventional tracker who looked for the path of least resistance. He would expect her to take the easiest route to make time. By midnight, the temperature had plummeted well below freezing. Maya's breath came out in thick, white clouds. Her muscles ached from the brutal incline, and her hands were bleeding from the sharp, icy rocks. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every time she felt her body wanting to give up, she remembered the image of her childhood home collapsing in flames, a tragedy caused by the reckless arrogance of the man now hunting her. Suddenly, a faint, unnatural sound echoed through the canyon below. The heavy crunch of a tactical boot against gravel. Maya instantly froze, pressing her body flat against the dark rock face, blending completely into the shadows. She stopped breathing, listening with absolute focus. Down in the ravine, 3 figures were moving silently through the dark. They were wearing night vision goggles and carrying suppressed rifles. At the front of the tracking team was Master Chief Ethan Vance. He was moving with terrifying speed, tracking the faint footprints left behind by one of the male candidate pairs who had chosen the valley path. Through the darkness, Maya watched as Vance stopped. He knelt down, touching a broken twig on the ground. A cold smile appeared on his face. He signaled his team, and within seconds they vanished into the brush. Less than a minute later, a loud, desperate shout echoed through the valley, followed by the sound of simulated gunfire. The first pair of elite operators had been hunted down and eliminated within the first 4 hours. Maya watched from the high ridge, her eyes cold and analytical. Vance was fast, but he was predictable. He was relying on his standard tracking protocols. Maya looked up at the moon, calculating her remaining time. She had over 40 miles left to cover. The terrain was getting increasingly hostile, and the legend was already closing the gap. She tightened the straps on her tactical boots, ignored the biting pain in her bleeding hands, and stepped back into the shadows of the high peaks, moving deeper into the lion's den. By the 14th hour, the human body begins to eat itself. Maya could feel the dull, rhythmic throbbing in her temples, the unmistakable first stage of severe dehydration. Her throat felt like sandpaper, and her core temperature had dropped dangerously low from spending the entire night navigating the frozen, wind-blasted ridges. Down in the lower valleys, 3 more pairs of candidates had already been caught. The thermal imaging drones deployed by Vance's tracking team were sweeping the easy routes with ruthless efficiency. Maya had avoided them by sticking to the high-altitude, unstable scree fields where the loose, shifting shale rock left almost no heat signature and completely masked her tracks. But it came at a brutal physical cost. Every step forward required her to slide half a step back. Her thighs burned, and her fingertips were raw and caked in dried blood. She crouched behind a jagged granite boulder, checking her bearings. According to her mental map, she had covered nearly 42 miles. She was ahead of schedule, but the final 18 miles were the most dangerous. The terrain flattened out into a narrow, suffocating bottleneck canyon known as the Throat. There was no high ground to hide in there. She would be forced down into the open. Suddenly, a high-pitched metallic buzz echoed through the sky above. Maya didn't look up. Looking up would expose the pale skin of her face, reflecting what little moonlight cut through the clouds. Instead, she instantly dropped to the ground, pulling a lightweight, mud-covered tarp over her body and pressing herself into a shallow trench between 2 rocks. An autonomous surveillance drone drifted directly overhead, its bright red infrared camera lens sweeping the exact patch of ground where she lay. Maya held her breath, forcing her racing heart to slow down. If her body heat spiked, the drone's sensors would flag her position. She counted to 30 in her head, feeling the coldness of the earth mountain seeping through her clothes. Finally, the buzzing sound faded into the distance. She threw off the tarp and stood up, but as she did, a cold chill ran down her spine. The drone hadn't been searching randomly, it had been herding her. From the dense tree line just 300 yards behind her, a dark silhouette emerged, moving with terrifying, relentless speed. It was a single man, tracking her not by technology, but by pure predatory instinct. Master Chief Ethan Vance. He had broken away from his main tracking team. He had figured out her high-altitude strategy, realized she was outsmarting his electronic sweeps, and had come to hunt her down personally. Maya's eyes narrowed. She had a choice. She could run toward the bottleneck canyon and try to outpace a living legend in a foot race, or she could turn this survival exercise into something else entirely. She chose the latter. Maya sprinted toward a dense, shadowy thicket of mountain brush at the entrance of the canyon. She didn't try to hide her tracks this time. In fact, she deliberately snapped a thick branch at shoulder height and left a deep, obvious boot print in the soft mud near a natural water runoff. Once inside the thicket, she went to work. Without a knife or tools, she had to rely on primitive survival mechanics. She found a heavy, fallen oak branch, thick, rigid, and tapered to a sharp point at one end. Using a sharp piece of flint rock, she quickly notched a deep groove into the center of the branch. She stripped the tough, fibrous inner bark from a nearby root, twisting it into a crude but incredibly strong rope. Working with frantic, silent precision, she bent back a young, highly flexible sapling tree, anchoring it to a heavy rock using her homemade rope. She attached the sharpened oak stake to the tensioned loop, concealing the entire apparatus beneath a thick layer of dead leaves and pine needles. It was a classic jungle deadfall trap, modified for the high desert. If anyone tripped the low-lying vine she had stretched across the path, the sapling would snap forward, driving the heavy stake directly into their torso with enough force to shatter bone. She stepped back, blending into the dark foliage just 10 yards away, waiting. Her breathing was completely silent. Less than 3 minutes later, the brush parted. Vance stepped into the clearing. He didn't look like a man who had been awake and tracking for 14 hours. His face was entirely calm, his rifle held in a low, ready position, his eyes scanning the shadows with lethal intelligence. He paused, his boot hovering just inches away from the hidden tripwire. He looked down. A faint, knowing smile touched his scarred lips. "Amateur," Vance whispered into the quiet air. He didn't step on the wire. Instead, he stepped completely over it, turning his head toward the exact bush where Maya was hiding. "You think a basic tracking trap is going to stop me, girl? I invented half the survival manuals you read at Academy." But as Vance took that step forward, his boot pressed into a completely different patch of loose earth. Maya hadn't built one trap, she had built two. The visible tripwire was just the bait. The loose earth gave way, dropping Vance's right leg into a hidden deep pit trap. The sudden loss of balance threw him off. As he instinctively fell forward to catch himself, his shoulder struck a secondary, completely unhidden vine. Snap! Above his head, a heavy log suspended by a rope swung downward like a pendulum, smashing directly into Vance's rifle. The sheer impact ripped the weapon out of his hands, sending it flying across the clearing and clattering into a deep, rocky ravine below. Vance reacted instantly, pulling his leg out of the pit and rolling backward into a defensive stance, his hand instantly flying to the tactical knife on his belt. But before he could draw it, a shadow burst from the bushes. It was Maya. She didn't run away. She used his momentary disorientation to close the distance. She struck him with a brutal, lightning-fast palm strike directly to his sternum, knocking the breath out of him, followed by a sweeping low kick meant to take his legs out. Vance blocked the kick with his shin, his eyes widening in genuine shock at the sheer speed and power of her attack. He grabbed her by the shoulder, using his massive weight advantage to hurl her against a heavy pine tree. Maya hit the tree hard, the air exploding from her lungs, but she didn't stop. As Vance lunged forward to pin her arms, she grabbed his wrist, twisted her body, and used his own forward momentum to execute a perfect judo throw. The legendary Navy SEAL slammed heavily onto the rocky ground, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. Maya didn't follow up with another strike. She knew she couldn't defeat a man his size in a prolonged fistfight without weapons. Instead, she stood over him for a fraction of a second, her hollow, icy eyes staring down into his. "You're getting old, Master Chief," Maya said, her voice completely calm despite her gasping breath. Before Vance could get back to his feet, Maya turned and vanished into the pitch-black shadows of the Bottleneck Canyon, leaving the legend sitting in the dirt, completely weaponless and utterly stunned. The final stretch of the Mojave was no longer just a physical obstacle. It was a psychological war zone. The Bottleneck Canyon, known as the Throat, lived up to its name, narrowing down until the sheer rock walls almost touched, trapping the heat of the rising morning sun. The freezing night had vanished, replaced instantly by a dry, suffocating furnace. Maya's lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue feeling twice its normal size from severe dehydration. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid fire. She was running on pure adrenaline and a decade's worth of quiet fury. Behind her, the canyon was eerily quiet, but Maya knew better than to think she was safe. Ethan Vance wouldn't be stopped by a single judo throw or lost rifle. If anything, what she had done in that clearing had stripped away his professional detachment. She had wounded his legendary pride in front of his own shadow unit. Now he wasn't just evaluating a candidate, he was hunting a rival. Maya checked her mental clock. She had roughly 3 miles left to reach the extraction point. The time limit was closing in, but so was the terrain. The Throat opened up into a massive, barren salt flat, a 2-mile expanse of blinding white sand with absolutely zero cover. To reach the extraction helicopter, she would have to sprint across that open desert in broad daylight. A single sniper on the ridge could spot a moving target from miles away. She paused at the edge of the canyon's mouth, leaning heavily against the cool stone. Her vision blurred for a second, black spots dancing at the edges of her consciousness. Her body was screaming at her to collapse, to just lie down in the shade and wait for the recovery team. "Get up," she whispered to herself, her voice a harsh, dry rasp. "He didn't stop when he ruined your family. You don't stop now." She smeared a handful of dark, wet clay from a drying basin across her forehead and cheeks to cut down the glare of the sun, took a deep, agonizing breath, and broke into a steady, rhythmic jog across the blinding white flats. She had covered roughly half a mile when the sound arrived. It wasn't a drone, and it wasn't a vehicle. It was the rhythmic, heavy thudding of boots hitting the hard-packed salt behind her. Maya didn't look back. She forced her aching legs to move faster, her stride lengthening. But the footsteps behind her were gaining ground with terrifying, unnatural speed. Suddenly, a massive weight slammed into her lower back, tackling her completely to the ground. Maya hit the hard salt crust with a sickening thud, rolling over instantly to defend herself. Standing over her, breathing heavily but looking completely unbreakable, was Master Chief Ethan Vance. His uniform was torn, his face was covered in dust and sweat, and his jaw was set in a hard, dangerous line. He had run her down through the heat of the desert without a single drop of water. "End of the line, girl," Vance growled, stepping forward, his massive frame blocking out the burning sun. "You're out of time, you're out of options, and you're out of air." Maya scrambled backward, digging her boots into the salt, forcing herself back up into a defensive stance. "I'm still breathing, Master Chief. That means I still have options." Vance lunged forward, throwing a heavy, straight right hand that would have knocked an ordinary person unconscious. Maya ducked beneath the strike, using her lower center of gravity to drive her elbow hard into his ribs. Vance didn't even flinch. He caught her by the forearm, twisted her arm behind her back, and slammed her face first into the burning white ground, pinning her down with his knee driven deep into her shoulder blade. Maya gasped, the sharp salt crystals cutting into her cheek. She was completely pinned. The sheer physical strength of the Navy SEAL legend was overwhelming. "You're fast, Maya. I'll give you that," Vance said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper right next to her ear as he held her down. "You've got skills I haven't seen in a candidate in 20 years. But you made one critical mistake. You let your emotions dictate your movements. You aren't here to join this unit. You're here for me." Maya froze, her eyes widening slightly against the dirt. Vance applied more pressure to her shoulder, locking her down completely. "You think I didn't recognize that look in your eyes on the tarmac? You think I don't know the file of every single person who enters my compound? 10 years ago, Sector 4, a faulty intelligence report signed by my hand. You were the kid who survived the collapse." A drop of sweat fell from Vance's face into the sand beside her. His voice wasn't mocking anymore. It was chillingly serious. "I know what you're trying to do," Vance continued. "You wanted to climb to the top of my world just to tear me down. You wanted to prove the legend was a lie. But out here, in the dirt, the truth doesn't care about your trauma. The truth only cares about who is left standing. And right now, you lose." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy black zip tie, the standard capture device for the exercise. If you locked her wrists, the evaluation was officially over. She would fail, her record would be flagged, and she would be cast out of the special operations community forever. Maya felt the cold plastic of the zip tie touch her wrist. In that split second, the exhaustion vanished. The pain in her bleeding fingers disappeared. The ghost of her past didn't weaken her. It became a volatile explosion of pure, unadulterated willpower. "I told you before, Vance," Maya spat, her voice laced with venom. "You should have kept your bullet." With a desperate, violent surge of energy, Maya didn't try to pull away from his grip. Instead, she threw her entire body weight into the direction of his knee, deliberately dislocating her own left shoulder with a horrific, sickening pop. The sudden, unexpected shift in her anatomy loosened Vance's leverage for a fraction of a second. It was all the space she needed. Maya swung her free right leg upward in a vicious, sweeping arc, striking Vance directly in the side of his neck with the heel of her heavy, tactical boot. The brutal blow shattered Vance's balance, sending the giant Navy SEAL crashing sideways onto the salt flats. Maya scrambled to her feet, her left arm hanging completely limp and useless at her side, her face twisted in agonizing pain. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her own left wrist with her right hand, braced her dislocated shoulder against the trunk of a dead desert shrub, and with a guttural scream of pure agony, she shoved her body forward. Thud-clack. The joint slammed back into its socket. Maya fell to her knees, panting, tears of sheer pain cutting tracks through the mud on her face. 10 yards away, Vance was already getting back up, shaking his head, a line of dark blood trickling from the corner of his mouth where her boot had struck him. He looked at her, seeing her snap her own shoulder back into place without a single tear, and for the first time in his entire military career, Ethan Vance felt a genuine flicker of fear. She wasn't just a candidate, she was a force of nature. Maya stood up, her jaw set, her breathing ragged but steady. She didn't hesitate. She turned toward the horizon, where the faint rhythmic whir of a military helicopter's rotor blades was finally echoing across the salt flats. The extraction point was just 1 mile away, and she was going to make it. The roar of the MH-60 Black Hawk helicopter was deafening as it hovered just 5 feet above the baking salt flats. Its massive rotor blades kicked up a blinding circular storm of white dust and sand, creating a chaotic vortex of wind. On board the aircraft, the remaining candidates who had been caught early in the exercise sat in the shadows of the cabin, their heads hung low in defeat. Then they saw her. Emerging from the swirling white haze like a ghost out of the desert was Maya. Her clothes were shredded, her skin was covered in a brutal mixture of sweat, clay, and dried blood, and her left arm was pressed tightly against her torso. But she was moving forward. Step by agonizing step, she breached the perimeter of the extraction zone. With one final, exhausting effort, Maya grabbed the structural frame of the helicopter door and pulled herself up into the cabin. She collapsed onto the metal floor, her chest heaving violently as her lungs finally drank in the cooler air inside the aircraft. The digital clock on the cabin bulkhead flashed in bright red numbers: 23, 58, 12. She had made it, with less than 2 minutes to spare. She had crossed 60 miles of the most unforgiving, hostile terrain on the planet, completely weaponless, completely starved, and completely alone. The other operators in the cabin stared at her in stunned, reverent silence. Miller, who had mocked her endlessly on the tarmac just 24 hours prior, slowly looked down at her bleeding hands, then up at her hollow, unyielding eyes. Without a single word, Miller reached over, picked up a fresh canteen of cold water, and handed it to her. It was the ultimate gesture of submission and respect from a Tier 1 operator. Maya took the canteen, nodding once, and drank greedily, feeling life slowly returning to her frozen muscles. "Look down," one of the Marines whispered, leaning out the open bay door. "Look who's coming." Maya wiped her mouth and leaned toward the edge of the doorway. Walking out from the wall of dust, his pace slow but steady, was Master Chief Ethan Vance. He didn't have his rifle. He didn't have his gear. His face was caked in white salt, and a deep purple bruise was forming along his jawline where Maya's tactical boot had struck him. He reached the helicopter, grabbed the handrail, and hauled his massive frame into the cabin. The entire aircraft fell dead silent. The atmosphere became heavy, the tension so thick it felt like it could suffocate the men inside. The other candidates instinctively backed away, giving the two rivals space. Vance stood in the center of the vibrating cabin, swaying slightly with the motion of the helicopter. He didn't look at Miller. He didn't look at the crew. His cold, flint eyes locked directly onto Maya, who was now standing up, bracing her back against the aluminum bulkhead to keep her balance. For a long, agonizing moment, neither of them spoke. The memories of a burning compound 10 years ago, a faulty intelligence report, and a decade of built-up fury hung in the air between them. The legend had met the girl he thought he broke, only to find out she had become a weapon designed to destroy him. Slowly, Vance reached into his chest pocket. He pulled out the spent, empty brass .308 casing, the very same bullet he had handed her on the tarmac, the one she had used to obliterate a steel target from 700 yards away in a blinding storm. He stepped closer, stopping mere inches from her. The giant Navy SEAL looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then, the hard, scarred lines of his face subtly softened. A look of profound, deeply ingrained respect took over his eyes. Vance held out his hand, offering the empty brass casing back to her. 10 years ago, I made a mistake, Vance said, his voice low, gravelly, and loud enough only for her to hear over the roar of the engines. I relied on broken data. I thought the mission was clean. I lived with that ghost every day of my life, thinking nobody survived that night. He placed the cold brass casing into her hand, wrapping his heavy fingers around hers for a brief second. I spent 20 years looking for someone strong enough to replace me when my time was up. Vance whispered, a faint, proud smile touching his lips. I thought I'd never find them, but today, you proved me wrong. You aren't just an operator, Maya. You are the future of this unit. He stepped back and snapped his right hand sharply to his temple, delivering a flawless, formal military salute to a subordinate candidate. It was something Ethan Vance had never done in his entire legendary career. Maya looked down at the empty casing in her palm, then looked back up at the man who had inadvertently shaped her entire destiny. The anger inside her didn't completely vanish, but it transformed. It settled into a cold, unbreakable sense of purpose. She didn't need to kill him to avenge her past. She had done something far more devastating. She had conquered his world, earned his ultimate respect, and taken his crown. She raised her right hand and returned the salute, her voice steady and echoing with absolute authority. "Thank you, Master Chief," Maya said. "I'll take it from here." As the Black Hawk helicopter lifted high into the desert sky, leaving the scorched terrain of Outpost Delta behind, the men in the cabin knew that the legend of Ethan Vance hadn't ended today. It had simply been passed on to the absolute wrong girl. Maya proved that when you were pushed to the absolute breaking point, your past doesn't have to define you. It can become the very ammunition you use to conquer your enemies. If you want to see how Maya takes command of the ultimate shadow unit and changes the face of special warfare forever, hit that subscribe button right now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment below letting me know what you thought of her incredible survival trap. Don't miss the next chapter of this legendary story. See you in the next video.